Welcome to the Iron John podcast. The following is a conversation between the mythologist and storyteller Ben Dennis and author, poet, and translator Robert Bringhurst. Both men will be active presenters at the 41st Minnesota Men's Conference, October 7th through the 12th, 2025, at Camp Miller on Sturgeon Lake in Minnesota. For more information or to register, go to the website minnesotamensconference.com. Here's Ben and then Robert.
In yours and my conversations in the past, I'm really struck by your, and this isn't an interview way, by the way, I'm just sort of kicking it off here, but I'm just really struck with the way you approach translation. I've got these notes here. You talked about literacy not being of the written word, but from the oral tradition. And then you also talk about the act of translating as a process of decolonizing the mind. So I don't know if that's something that you want to talk a little bit about, but I'd love to hear some of your ideas on that.
Decolonizing the mind is, of course, a phrase I learned from Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a man I was extremely fond of, who died just a few days ago. Marvelous novelist, a marvelous playwright, marvelous storyteller, who grew up in Africa. The effects of colonialism everywhere in his life. Had the privilege, if that's what it is, of growing up in North America, where I didn't even know what colonialism was until I was well along in life and began to see that I'd been part of it all my life. Anyway, I grew up intermittent contact with Native people from very early in my life, and we didn't talk about politics. I don't think I knew what politics was. It was something my parents talked about with each other, but they didn't talk about it with me. And so I didn't think in political terms about colonialism or anything else. But as I began to listen to old Native people tell stories and began to learn some indigenous languages and to think about these things, I began to understand that writing was not necessary for civilization, that you could have a real culture, a complex and rich culture that ran entirely on the spoken word. You know, that's not what people told me in school. In school, they told me I had to learn to read and write because otherwise I would be an uncivilized savage. You know, I mean, my mother taught me to read and write before I ever started school, so the technological part of it was kind of taken care of before I was even aware that it existed. But the prejudice, and there's colonialism in spades. This assumption that we, the dominant society, know how to do things and nobody else does, and nobody else understands the world the way we do or controls it the way we do. That's a strange thing to force onto a 6-year-old kid. Anyway, I began to take that idea apart almost as soon as I became aware of it, because my friends in indigenous communities had helped me to see that it could be taken apart. So I've been doing this all my life. I've been studying native languages and initially listening to people tell stories and then finding the old stories, and mostly in the archives, because field linguists have been doing this work since the late 19th century in North America, taking down stories, writing them down phonetically from the dictation of oral poets, myth tellers, storytellers, and occasionally they got published, but then they just sat on the university library shelves, and often they didn't get published at all. They just sat in the archives in the Smithsonian or the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, or National Museum in Ottawa, or other places. And then those archives are rich with the Library of Native American Oral Literature.
Yeah, it's fascinating to listen about that. You brought me to mind of my early upbringing. I wasn't taught to read quite the same way. I mean, I was taught when I went to school, but I was raised in part by my grandparents who would read to me every single night before.
That's the way it's done. Yeah, that's great.
So yeah, so I had the oral tradition fed to me from the time that I was 6 years old on,
Right.
and reading and listening to and being, everything from, Smokey the Cowhorse to Rudyard Kipling to, I didn't even know, but every night there was a story to be read, Grimm's fairy tales, all the rest of that. So there was a huge oral tradition per se in my upbringing.
Yes, and there you see the oral written working together instead of fighting with each other, one trying to take control of the other, and reinforcing each other. That's what writing is really for, is to support the oral tradition, not to displace it.
Well, that doesn't codify, so often I think we get to the written word and story or whatever. And how many stories have we heard from Grimm's or from, any of the different peoples around? Whereas you read the story as it's written down, however it was taken, you recognize that there was at one time a livingness of that story that has been sort of frozen in time. And there's a resistance or a hesitancy to let that story be alive again.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I have a story that I tell from Grimm's Devil's Sooty Brother, where there's a fiddle that is core to the protagonist's journey towards, resolution, healing, and the end of the story. Well, in the written word, it's he received that in the underworld as a gift, but in the written word, it tells that piece of the story at the very end of the story
Mm-hmm.
instead of, where it came along. And I can only imagine that in different tellings that fiddle arrived in his hands in different places in the story, depending on how the audience was engaging, how the storyteller was engaging, and that sense of aliveness of the story. Yeah, I'm just curious about that, because I know that you and I have spoken before, and you're clear about your role as translator and not so much as storyteller.
Well, when I'm studying the words of somebody who maybe dictated a story to a field linguist in 1902 or 1905 or 1899, I want to hear what that old person said. I don't want to interfere with it. I don't want to remanufacture the story into my own terms and my own time. Its value to me partly is that it takes me away from my place and my time, and gives me insight into somebody else's world, which is, after all, this world. It's still here. I don't mean to say that the story should be frozen. Stories can't be frozen. Well, they can, but they don't benefit from freezing. They have to be brought back to life, and then they will live their own lives, and they'll get themselves told
Mhm.
somehow. That's surely what happens when your grandparents read a story to you out of a book. The story goes into you if you're a receptive person, and it takes root there, and then you might tell it to somebody else, and you'll tell it not by reciting what you heard read from a book, but by bringing the story back to life.
Mhm.
It's jazz instead of playing from the page.
Mhm.
But jazz musicians things down too, and refer to their written notes. You don't have to throw writing away in order to avoid being imprisoned by it.
Mhm.
You can make it part of the living culture.
Mhm.
So when that happens, there isn't just one written version of something. We're not talking about sacred immutable texts here, but just as writing is an aid to the perpetual life of stories.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean that's, for listening to you over this time that I've known you, it's like that's one of the things that I've find some of the greatest amount of regard and respect is that, you hold so clearly to what as best as you can, the lineage of the story that is given to you or that you found. To me, that's an astounding and important aspect of all of this. It reminds me a little bit of some of the discussions we've had around the language structure. English has a particular way of being in culture, and then the languages that you're translating from, they have a different kind of structure and a different worldview built into the language. You mentioned in some of the storytelling that if you have actually participated or seen an event, you speak about it in one way, but if you've been given that story or told it by another person, then you have to language it in a very different way. This is not the case with English, of course. I'm curious what that might, how we might talk about that a little bit.
Well, it works, really in ordinary conversation as well as in formal storytelling. In English, I can say, my mother was born in Idaho, but in Haida, or Maidu, or any number of other Native American languages, to say that is just wrong. I can't say my mother was born in any place because I wasn't there to witness this event. I've only heard about it. So to be an honest person, I have to say, my mother, they say, was born in Idaho, or my mother, she says, was born in Idaho, or something. I have to clarify that this information, it's part of the oral tradition. I can't, I guess, say I was born in some place because although I was present, I wasn't very aware of it. Um, but I can say, I had bacon and eggs for breakfast yesterday because I was there.
Yeah. Yeah, to me, that's a beautiful distinction. We've noticed some of the guys talk about English language being a noun-based language and therefore envisions the world in a particular way. I'm always interested in how, the shifting gears a little bit, how poetry plays into that. I know that you're a poet, and I've read some of your poetry, and it's pretty amazing to me. And while I've written a handful of poems, I don't consider myself a poet in that regard. But I really, really genuinely love bringing voice to the poems that do come across me. Again, back to that upbringing in sort of the spoken word as it was the pacing, the nuance, the gesture of poetry to me is incredibly beautiful. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
It's a great pleasure to talk about poetry with people who understand, as you do, that it lives in the voice, not on the page. You meet people in writing workshops all the time who think you can do this in silence, who don't talk to themselves when they write, who stumble over their own words when they try to read them aloud. Real poets write out loud, they compose out loud, and then they take dictation from themselves. So they're always writing a speakable language because they spoke it before they wrote it down.
Mhm.
And that's true not only of poets, but of prose writers as well. Real prose, good prose is speakable prose. There's an awful lot of unspeakable prose in circulation at the moment.
I've certainly read more than a little bit of that. Well, I love this phrase or sentence that you wrote, poet in your essay, Poetry and Thinking. It said, "Poetry is thinking, real thinking, and real thinking is poetry." I love that. I mean,
Oh,
it's
thank you.
yeah,
Uh,
it's beautiful.
well, my hunch is that it's also true, and that those two things go together somehow. I don't mean to deny that there's such a thing as prosaic thinking. There certainly is. You know, I've been wrestling for the last several days with a problematic door in my house, an old, probably 40-year-old sliding door where I needed to replace the rollers, and I couldn't get the beast out of the sliding part, the movable part out of the frame because I've remodeled the house, put a third story on it, and I probably squashed the door frame in the process, just a millimeter or two. Anyway, there was plenty of profanity and plenty of prosaic, unpoetic discussion.
I
But
don't know. I have my hunch that your what you call prosaic conversation has a poetic lilt to it.
well, maybe. Anyway, we finally, my brother-in-law was here for a few days, and with his considerable help, I finally got this beast out of its frame, and I was able to replace the rollers. And now, with the help of a healthy young neighbor, I'll probably get the thing back in its frame. So, you know, there's a not very interesting story to be told about this. I don't think it has a chance in hell of becoming a poem, but one of the things we do with language is you know, solve problems, and that's not always poetic, but at its best, it surely is.
Hmm. I've heard plenty of stories that have me everything from weeping in laughter to weeping for weeping to fascinated with, the process of just exactly that kind of a problem.
Yes,
So we do bring, I think that's one of the things about the poetic mind, I think, is it brings a level of creativity to whatever's in front of us. Um,
indeed, indeed. I've been reading some poems lately by a man named Fairchild, B.H. Fairchild, he calls himself, who writes about men running lathes and working in factories and so forth, and he makes fine poetry out of often harsh and sometimes hilarious
mhm,
events of a normal life in an industrial society. But he also makes some very poignant observations about, you know, what's not there, what's missing, the words that men can't use, or the expression, the emotions they can't talk about,
mhm.
the perceptions they are not allowed to share. Real life is a complicated, messy business, and you know, there are always things to be learned from it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it strikes me that poetry is concerned with what's not there as much as it is with what's there.
Well,
And
yes, yes.
you know,
That's how you see it. You know, I was sitting at the breakfast table, no, yesterday, and Harry Woodpecker crashed into the window, and he was unhurt, but he spent the next 5 or 6 minutes clinging to the door frame.
mhm,
And I think that I could see more or less, what was going on in his mind. As far as I was concerned, he'd crashed into the window. But surely the woodpecker didn't see it that way. From the woodpecker's point of view, some invisible, silent force had come out of nowhere and whacked him, which meant, you know, that the world was a more dangerous place than he had assumed it was, and the safe thing to do was just sit there, cling to the door frame for a little while and see what's going to happen next.
Hmm.
He recovered his courage and flew off. I mean, what an astonishing thing it would be if you knew nothing about glass and windows to suddenly find that there was a pane of glass in the middle of the air. That would take your breath away, literally and physically. And it did, I guess, in this case.
Yeah, you have this phrase, the polyhistorical mind. Is that right? So
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
that
that's word
woodpecker.
shouldn't get. You should. I should have better sense than to invent long words like that. But uh, I have
I
to.
don't know. It struck me as being pretty appropriate, especially given what's going on in the world today. It seems to be a huge drive to simplify in ways that just don't make any sense.
Yes,
But for the woodpecker, it's like his life suddenly became a little bit more complex.
it's really important to me to share this space with the woodpeckers and the
Mhm.
nuthatches and the deer and the other folks who live around here. I try as best I can to learn from them to learn to see things at least a little bit in their terms, see to try to imagine how things appear to them. And I'm constantly learning from them. There was a doe who dropped her fawn here just a couple of days ago. For some reason, she chose to do it right on the stone path in front of my library.
Oh
Uh,
my God.
she could have moved 4 feet away into the tall grass and given the fawn some cover, but for some reason she didn't. Is this because she didn't have any choice in the matter? Is it because she was a ditz and didn't know that right there on the path is a lousy place to drop your fawn? I don't know. But I came upon the fawn just, minutes, I think, after it was born. And because of where it was, I was initially fearful that it was stillborn. I discovered that it was alive. Doe is still around, looking nervously at me, and so I left it alone. And eventually, that is, that night in the dark, the doe came back and took the fawn away. And just this morning, I saw what I suspect is the same fawn gambling around with the same doe. Here's something that's about as elemental and basic as it gets, birth.
Hmm.
And it was almost as if I'd never seen it before, I mean, I was so innocent, so stunned. I didn't even know whether it was dead or alive until I got up there and poked it and checked. How could a person be so dumb? I'm 78 years old. How could I be so innocent as not to know that fawns are sometimes born on the sidewalk instead of in the grass? But there we are. Anyway, looks like this story has turned out okay so far. I think the
Well,
fawn is
I had,
alive
I
and
had
well.
I had this amazing experience. I was driving. It was up on near Friday Harbor where my sister and her husband live, and I was taking a drive up the country road, and I caught something out of the corner of my eye and realized that right in the apex of a corner, the
Hmm?
part of the road where people will cut the corner and go into the dirt
Yeah,
a little bit
yeah, right.
with almost no fog line, there was a fawn laying in the grass about 8 inches away from the white line on the side of the road.
Oh, yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm just, thing is like they say you shouldn't touch them, you don't want to do that.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking this is going to become a flat fawn if something doesn't happen. So I
Mm.
stopped and carefully lifted the fawn and walked it 20, 30 yards into the grass and laid it down and hoped for the best. So
Yeah, good for you.
it was just frozen. So,
Yeah,
because that's
yeah,
one of their defense mechanisms, but there's no defense against a car. So,
right. Yeah, Yeah, and I've seen them just lie down right in the middle of the road. Not the best survival tactic in a world full of motor vehicles.
They've not developed instincts for 60-mile-an-hour steel
Right.
vehicles.
That's right.
It's interesting. You wrote in another place, the mechanics of metaphor are excruciatingly simple, like binary maths, but they nevertheless give wonderfully subtle and complex results.
Hmm.
And I've been playing with metaphor as much as I can for quite a while. And one of the things that I've struggled with is when I see people or institutions try to, what I called concretizing the metaphor, which of course takes the life out of it. But it's also important to me to see how metaphor functions both poetically and in the storied traditions, the oral traditions, because it enlivens, it brings into the imagination things that would otherwise may never have arrived there.
Mm.
That's one of the reasons that I love telling stories, is to see what occurs in the room.
Yes. Yes.
Remember one time it was early in my career and trying to figure out what my voice was sounding like, but it was powerful because it's when the Greeks talk about the gods mounting the characters, for thinking of the relationship between Mentor and Telemachus, and Athena comes into Mentor's essence and speaks through him. I had
Hmm.
that feeling one time of telling a story to a group of combat veterans, and one of the guys had barricaded himself back at the back of the room, pulled the couches, and laid down on the floor because that was the only way that he could be in the room and feel anything resembling safety.
Yeah.
This is, 20 years after being in combat.
Right.
And so I told a story over 3 days. And by the third day, that person, his therapist was there with him as an assistant.
Mm.
By the end of the third day, he was sitting in the front row, hands on knees, watching everything that was going on with me as a storyteller. And Miguel Rivera was there as drumming, listening to every word. And the therapist came up to me afterwards and he said, "That hasn't happened in 20 years. He hasn't stepped up on the forward like that in 20 years." It certainly wasn't my skill as a storyteller because everybody kept then yelling at me, speak up." But I attribute that to the power of the story itself and the images that get delivered when you bring voice and intent and gesture to the act of storytelling. And so
Well, I
there's
don't doubt that the power of the story had a lot to do with it, but I think the power of the storyteller is also involved here, and the fact that you're able to give yourself to the story, to become the vehicle of the story, is crucial to making those things happen. That's what would allow this unfortunate person to find his way out of his shell there and sit in the front row with his chin in his hands. Um, the way Miguel gets into his drums and his songs and his stories, people respond to that because it's alive, it's real.
that sense of reality departs from the sort of codified dictatorial perspective that I see so often, that when you can actually engage with the living world, like what you were talking about with the woodpecker and the deer. I spend almost every day I go out into the woods here nearby, and I'm usually on a bicycle. Sometimes I'm walking, but it's always astounding to me to see, after doing it for years, I've been doing it, that specific practice on an almost a daily basis for 6, 7 years now. And it's amazing what shows up, what the subtle, small movements, the way that things grow, the way nothing stays exactly the same, that it's always moving, always growing, ebbing and flowing with the seasons. To me, it's just that it's an amazing way of engaging with the world. The beauty is just truly wonderful.
It is. It is. And when people lose their capacity for amazement, for wonder, something terrible has happened to them. stories can help them find their way back to those essential things.
I rehearse my stories as I'm riding my bicycle through the woods out loud so the trees can hear me.
Yeah.
And I bring tears, I bring anger, grief, I bring joy, wonder, that all comes with me when I go out into the woods because I figure, those spaces, those beings that are there have enough depth and breadth to help carry whatever it is that I have on my shoulders.
Yeah.
And
Well, I've heard old Irishmen to talk about Irish storytellers who tell their stories to the back of the wagon if they don't have a human audience at hand, because the stories have captured them and they want to be in the company of the stories and if somebody else isn't going to tell the story to them, they're going to tell it to the wagon. And it works. I've heard a story about an Irish storyteller who was coming home from a storytelling session in another village, and he'd heard a story he'd never heard before, and he loved it, and so of course he had to tell it to himself in order to retain it, in order to be able to carry it on. And so he's walking home in the dusk, telling the story to himself, and he crossing a creek, and he's so wrapped up in the story, he stumbles over the stones and falls on his face in the water. But I didn't care, he said. I had my story. There's a man with his priorities in the right order. The story comes first, and keeping your feet dry, your face dry, that's a lesser concern.
I love it. That's one of the things Danny Deerdorf, which we've talked about him before. He talked about how stories would find their way into your body and into your
Yeah,
bones.
yeah,
And when you really were carrying a story well, it was coming out from your bones into the world.
uh-huh.
It has almost a crystalline structure in the sense that it vibrates, like crystals do. And that vibration is something that resonates within us as storytellers and as story listeners, I think, too.
That's a very fine thing to say. A story has a crystalline structure. I mean, clearly, a story is not solid. There's stories are in some sense liquid. They're flexible, but they do have a crystalline structure if they have clarity.
Yeah. And I mean that in the sense of vibration, not the hardness that we get associated with gemstones, but there is that vibration, that solidity in the world in one way, but also vibrational and reactive and in concert with the world in another way.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's a really ongoing, unfolding relationship with the images, the things that come up, and the mystery. There's a tremendous amount of mystery in there that at least I experience.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking earlier about the oral tradition, about no society or civilization can occur without the written word, that sort of prejudicial perspective. And I'm just imagining, well, gee, the Irish managed a pretty long and colorful history before writing came along.
They did very well indeed, yes. But I mean, the part of the reason we know about that is that they have succeeded in retaining
Mm,
contact with that oral tradition even after the arrival of writing. The problem comes when people are so impressed with writing that they allow the oral tradition to evaporate.
right.
Then you're in trouble because your writing will be crap if you don't have an oral tradition for it to be nourished by.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. I know it's funny in my writing, I struggle with my writing. And invariably, I get to a place where I can't seem to put down the words correctly. So the only thing that I can do, there's two things that I do. I put away the computer and take out a piece of paper and a pencil.
Yeah,
And the other thing is I start reading or reciting out loud what I'm trying to say as I write it in pencil.
right.
It uses completely different parts of the brain when you're using the flowing movement of a pen or a pencil.
Yeah,
And then voice brings conversation. The world speaks back, whether it's coming back with English language words or not. The world speaks back to us when we speak to the world.
Yes, yes. Well, good idea to talk to rocks and trees. Then you can listen to them too.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that's wonderful. I saw the title of one of your essays, which I don't have much from the essay. I could probably go into it, but the audible light in the eyes.
Mm-hmm.
I love that juxtaposition of image that our eyes can hear and our ears can see.
Well, they do.
Of
Somehow
course,
they do, yeah. Mm.
of course. In the linear, literal, not literary, but literal world tends to, discount those sorts of engagements with the world.
Well, that's why I talk about oral literacy. And people think, well, that's a nonsensical phrase, but take yourself out into the real world, out into the forest or the grasslands or whatever you have, and you will notice yourself reading the landscape, seeing tracks, seeing signs of life and death, uh, seeing the deer trails and the raccoon tracks in the mud, and seeing how the wind turns the leaves over, and how the birds move and the insects move. Your eyes are listening to the world, and they are reading the text of the world, and your ears are hearing those things, and then you become the translator. You become the person who can speak about these things in human language to other humans.
Mhm.
The writing grows out of literacy, in the normal sense, grows out of that rich tradition, and it doesn't replace that tradition. It rests on top of it, or functions beside it, supplements it in some way. If the oral tradition doesn't stay healthy, the literate tradition, no matter how sophisticated it is, will be essentially worthless.
Right. Wow. It brings to mind your one of your latest books, Learning to Die. One of the things that I took from the book was that the importance of being as fully alive and present in the world right now, because we have both individually, because we're all of us are going to die, and then as a species, we don't have forever. We have what we have now, and so there's a certain kind of I think what you did is you invited a certain kind of reverence that I think is somewhat uncommon, and as well as an engagement with the living world as we move through. I'm looking out the window right now, and there's wild roses growing in just in the understory of the trees next, nearby,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
just watching a hummingbird fly from flower to flower, and the bees and the various, this sense of, for me, almost jaw-dropping wonder at the beauty of what goes on around me, and really truly being engaged with that as best as I'm able. Not as a commodity, not as a media piece of content or something to sell or something to take advantage of, but just simply in the sense of being. I think that's part of what we talk about with myth and story, part of what we talk about with poetry. I think we are reflecting that relationship. If we're living our life well, we're reflecting that relationship with the living world.
Well, there it is, right there. That capacity for wonder, for astonishment, for reverence. Surely everybody has this, but not everybody allows it to flourish the way you do.
Yeah, I was also thinking about, we have a lot of self-judgment. I think that's one of the things that comes up in the conversations around the stories and rituals that we do, is that we forget that it doesn't matter how badly we limp, the world will still meet us,
Mm-hmm.
and will meet us with beauty. And each of us has our own limp. I mean, I think I heard Robert Bly say something along the life is you have to learn to limp your own limp, or somebody else will have to limp it for you.
Yeah, I've been working a lot on that lately.
It seems to
On
be a
my own.
never-ending chore.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really struck with this, that Learning to Die book really touched me in a lot of different ways. Yeah, I don't want to go too far into the condition of the world. Everybody's talking about the condition of the world, from a political or event basis. And I'm really more interested in how do we step into a way of embodying or recognizing or expressing the beauty that's around us. Because I don't think opposition to whatever it is that you find yourself in opposition is really the medicine that's being called for. It occurs to me that the medicine that's being called for is to bring beauty to the conversation
Mm.
and let that infuse, hopefully, where those conversations go. Um, yeah, I don't know what more I can say about that at this point.
Well, we're we're lucky, you and I here, that the bombs are not falling on us, the missiles are not landing in our front yards. When that happens, it can be difficult to pay attention to the beauty, but when you can, yeah, you better take your chance.
Well, and also hold on to that for those that aren't able to in the moment.
Mm.
I was reading the poet Auden,
Yeah.
and just that sense of finding beauty even in the midst of that devastation, and not letting go of the grief, not letting go of the horror of what he experienced, but allowing there to be some beauty as well.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's an easy thing to let go of if we're not diligent with ourselves.
Mm.
Um, just thinking back to the men's conference and our relationship with ritual and trying to embody some of what it is that we experienced during that time together, that short time together. And there's a kind of poetry in that as well. Watching the men dance, the drumming, the different kinds of, crafting of shrines or whatever it happens to be to find a sense of exuberance in being alive and being together.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. I was going to ramble, so
Yeah. Good. Fine thing to do.
yeah, I think so. But yeah, I just realizing, one of the great beauties that I see that when the guys come together is we all know how culture has sort of encouraged a kind of posturing, this sort of pseudo masculine posturing,
Hmm. Hmm.
and then and how thin that posture can be when you invite the men to engage in acts of beauty. So one of the things that I do when I'm doing smaller groups is I invite, okay, gentlemen, we're going to make a gateway. You've been participating in the gateway so that we can actually make a physical step into a different space of how to be together. And then I have the guys to make a shrine to beauty
Mm.
and one to grief.
Mm. Uh,
And that's the extent of the instructions.
mm.
And I watch these guys kind of mill around, they shuffle their feet, they go, what the hell am I going to do here? And then once the little seed's been planted and has a chance to sprout a little bit, watch these guys running all over the place, picking up flowers, bits of stone, wood, and creating some of the most astounding examples of beauty or grief or whatever it happens to be. Who would have thought? And
Oh.
there it is.
Oh. Mhm.
And then we feed that with our poems and our experiences and our stories. And um, I think it's a worthwhile task.
Mm. Ben, let me read you a little bit of a little portion of a poem called "Beauty" by the fellow B.H. Fairchild, who I mentioned earlier in this conversation. We are at the Bargello in Florence, and she says, "What are you thinking?" And I say, "Beauty." thinking of how very far we are now from the machine shop and the dry fields of Kansas, the treeless horizons of slate skies and the muted passions of roughnecks and scrabble farmers, drunk and romantic enough to weep more or less silently at the darkened end of the bar out of what else? Loneliness, meaning the ache of thwarted desire, of, in a word, beauty, or rather its absence. And it occurs to me again that no male member of my family has ever used this word in my hearing or anyone else's, except in reference perhaps to a new pickup or dead deer. This insight, this backward vision came to me as a young man, as some weirdness of the airwaves slipped through the static of our new Motorola with a discussion of beauty between Robert Penn Warren and Paul Weiss at Yale College. We were in Kansas eating barbecue-flavored potato chips and waiting for Father Knows Best to through the snow of rural TV in 1963. I felt transported, stunned. Here are two grown men discussing beauty seriously and with dignity, as if they and the topic were as normal topics of discussion between men, such as soybean prices, or why the commodities market was a sucker's game, or Oklahoma football, or Gimpy Niederland almost dying from his hemorrhoid operation. They were discussing beauty, tossing around allusions to Plato and Aristotle and someone named Pater. Fairchild is a fine observer of the nature of North American colonial culture, where the men harden themselves, maybe because they have to, or maybe because that's just the way it's done where they live. And they pay a price for this, and sometimes they refuse to recognize the price they've paid, refuse to think about it. There it is, nevertheless. The beauty that you cannot speak of is all around you, and sometimes it's worth taking the time to pay it some attention.
I think you're absolutely right. What an astounding, amazing poem. I'm definitely going to track that one down. It's funny you mentioned, his background, because I also met another wonderful poet at the Great Mother Conference this year, a gentleman named Steve Scafidi, and he's an amazing lifelong poet whose whatever his work is as a cabinet maker. So he spends his life and days working with men and working with his hands and wood and sawdust and everything else like that. And then the rest of his time he spends writing poetry.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. It's like there's nothing that says that a man with calloused hands can't engage with an astounding reverence for beauty.
Right.
In fact, I would say that my part of my upbringing was with a grandfather. My mom's father was a welder. He had the biggest, gnarliest hands that you could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
That had more gentleness to them and more creativity to them than anything that I can remember as a young child.
Right.
So, thank you for that poem. That's incredible.
It comes from a book called The Art of the Lathe.
I'm going to find that one.
All right, wait a minute. Maybe I got that wrong. Just hang on a second. Yes, The Art of the Lathe. That's what it's called. Yeah, there's some fine work in there.
Well, we got an hour here. Do you have a poem that you would like to share to kind of help us close things off that you've written?
I didn't bring anything of my own here. I just brought Fairchild's work. Hold on a second. I'll see if I can find something.
Okay.
Yeah, these things are all too long for the moment, but I'll just read you a few lines from something here. The heron has practiced his silence longer than time has been time. When he rises and speaks, there is no one in the cove who doesn't listen. There is no one in the cove who couldn't translate what he says, and also no one in the cove who wouldn't realize the heron had been lost in that translation. Everything speaks for itself in this world, and everything rests in what is unspoken.
Wow. Thank you for that, Robert. That was beautiful.
Well, thank you. It's been very nice talking to you.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to this fall. I think we have a tremendous opportunity to rile things up a bit.
We should seize it then. Yes.
Seize the day, as they
All
say.
right. Okay. Take good care.
All right, we'll talk again soon.
Right.
All right.